I'm going to start this project with, or this presentation with a couple examples. So in 1977, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was investigating a textile manufacturer in North Carolina called Cannon Mills. And the EEO, in a statement, wrote, black hires are almost entirely in the blue-collar classifications, which are the lower-paying job titles. Now, here's an example from the last decade. Laura Lopez Sanders, who's an ethnographer, is embedded at an air conditioning manufacturing firm that she calls HiCap. And the manager comes up to her and says, you should go ask the temp agency to get the people for us. I want operators experienced with a screw gun. Just tell them we want Hispanic guys. To understand the difference between these two cases in the transformation over the last 40 years, I think it helps to show some simple diagrams. So here is Cannon Mills in 1977. It's a single firm captured by this large box, and it contains white workers and workers of color arranged in a hierarchy. Here's the more recent example. So there's HiCap, the manufacturing firm, and then it has various subordinate firms. It has subcontractors, it has temp agencies, and other firms basically working for it. These firms already pay less. They can be made to pay even less if HiCap is able to pressure them to cut costs. And workers of color are largely concentrated in the lower-paying subordinate organization. There are a few high-profile cases of this sort of thing happening. So with custodial work, or with custodial services subcontractor firms, with fast food franchises, with temp agencies, with oil supply chains, the dirtiest, most dangerous, lowest paying work is often split off to lower paying establishments and firms that primarily employ workers of color. So the question I have, which I'm going to try to answer in this presentation today, is when you compare these examples from this century to Cannon Mills in 1977, do these indicate some broader transformation in the structure of racial economic inequality? That is, have we moved to a system where Black and Hispanic workers are increasingly concentrated in separate lower-paying organizations? Specifically, I'm going to ask a series of questions. First, how has racial segregation into low-paying firms changed over the last half-century? Second, how much does this affect earnings gaps? And third, does the occupational sorting of blue-collar and service work into these low-paying establishments and low-paying firms, does this explain some of the trend? Before getting into the analysis, I think it helps to talk a bit about some of the forces at play. So in the last decade, there's been a lot of great sociological theory about racial inequality within organizations, focusing on hierarchies at work and focusing on competition over resources within workplaces. What I'm talking about here is a little bit different. It has to do with inequality in access to workplaces. So are white workers overrepresented at separate higher paying firms? This question of access is also not novel. So research on hiring discrimination and research on the role of social networks in finding jobs emphasizes the difficulty of entering workplaces and the obstacles that workers face when they're trying to gain access to firms. In addition, there's been a finding that in the last 30 or 40 years, there's rising racial segregation by workplace. So a white worker today is more likely to work with primarily white coworkers than they were 20, 30, or 40 years ago. However, just what this means for Black, white, and Hispanic white pay inequality is not really known. In particular, it's unclear how this sort of phenomenon here connects to some broader transformations in the organization of work. So to name just a few of these transformations, the rise of subcontracting, outsourcing, and franchising has split apart firms into webs of contracting organizations. This is what David Weil refers to as fishering. Globalizing product markets have allowed a small number of firms to claim basically disproportionate value from the markets they operate in. And on the flip side, firms have become flatter. They've become narrower, employing a smaller range of occupations and producing a smaller range of outputs. The upshot to all of these transformations is that where you work matters more and more for how much you earn. So increasingly, there is pay inequality between organizations or between firms. Relatedly, these transformations have meant that blue-collar and service work is increasingly shuttled off to low-paying firms, while white-collar professional work increasingly comes to dominate in the highest-paying sectors and the highest-paying firms, so-called superstar firms, for instance. So you could think of jobs in Silicon Valley or consulting work. So there's a pretty clear prediction here, which is if these transformations coincide with the rise of racial segregation by workplace, such that the higher paying firms are also increasingly employing primarily white workers, then that should worsen racial inequality overall in the US. I'm going to talk now about some of the most important data sets I use for this project. Before I do that, I need to acknowledge that this data was provided by the US Census Bureau. Everything I present here does not necessarily reflect the views of the Census Bureau. Okay, so the most important data set I have is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission data. So this is an establishment survey starting in the 60s, but my analysis will start in the 70s and going to the present. And what's really special about this survey is it asked respondents, who would be like HR officials or managers at their workplace, to fill out an employment matrix. So for instance, here on row 2, so the rows are occupations, there are 9 broad occupations, and the columns are demographic groups. So on row 2, column B, you would write the number of white male professionals at the workplace. This does not have information on pay. So to get that, I merged to some other Census Bureau records that let me calculate the average pay per employee. And I merged these at the firm level, and the merged data set runs from 1978 to the present. The other main data set I use is the LEHD, the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics data. So while the EEO is at the organization level, what's cool about the LEHD is it lets me follow individual workers and see where they work and how much they earn for each quarter. I have this for a subset of states, for 17 states. From 1998 to the present. Okay, so now we're ready to answer this first question. So how has racial segregation into low-paying firms changed over the last 50 years? So going back to the simple example with the 2 workplaces, we can take the log average pay at the 2 firms, and then take the average of those averages among white workers, and the average of those averages among black workers, and calculate their difference. If this difference is greater than 0, it means that black workers are overrepresented at low-paying firms. And we can do something similar for the gap between Hispanic and non-Hispanic white workers. So the prediction is that these differences should be greater than 0 in all years, but they should have become even larger over the last couple decades. That is indeed what I find. So in 1978, black workers worked at firms that paid about 5% less on average than where white workers worked, which is already pretty significant. But that increased to over 17% in more recent years. For Hispanic workers, there's been a similar trend, though slightly more gradual. Here's another way to look at it. So we can classify firms according to which quintile of the pay distribution they fall in. So number 1, all the way at the left, is the lowest paying fifth of firms. Number 5, all the way at the right, is the highest paying fifth of firms. And we can look at the demographic composition of these quintiles. So in 1978, about 14% of the workers in the lowest paying fifth of firms were black. Here's what it looks like in 2018. It's a bit hard to compare between the years because the overall rates of black and Hispanic workers changed during this time. So instead, I can show you the over or under representation in each quintile relative to the total workforce. So what this shows you is in 1978, black workers were overrepresented by almost 20% in the bottom fifth of firms, and were underrepresented by a little over 10% in the top fifth of firms. This is what it looks like in the last few years. So now black workers are overrepresented by about 35% in the bottom fifth of firms and underrepresented by about 35% in the top fifth of firms. For Hispanic workers, there's been a similar trend, though again, slightly more muted over time. the main takeaway from this stage of the analysis is, yes, for the last 50 years, workers of color have been overrepresented at the lowest paying workplaces. But this has become much, much more severe in recent decades. So the next question we might ask is, okay, I've shown this segregation trend. Does this actually affect pay? So does this concentration in lower paying workplaces actually produce a pay penalty for Black and Hispanic workers? This type of question is better answered using linked worker firm data, so I'll use the LEHD for it. So what I'm going to do is what's called an AKM style model. So I'm going to model earnings as a person's earnings as the sum of a firm fixed effect for the firm they work at, plus a person fixed effect. So you can think of the firm fixed effect, the phi term here, as the pay premium at that firm. So how much does it pay beyond what you might expect to earn working elsewhere? I'm going to fit this model among white workers only on rolling 3-year periods. And then, kind of similar to what I did before, I'll take the average of these firm premia among white workers and the average among Black workers, and I'll calculate the difference. This has a pretty clear interpretation, which is if you buy this model up here, which is it captures how the pay of white workers would change if they were redistributed to the same firms as Black workers. So again, I expect this to be positive in all years, and that is what I find. So in 1998, so notice now that we're starting in 1998 instead of 1978. In 1998, Black workers worked at firms where the premium was about 0.02 log dollars less than where white workers worked. That increased to over 0.06 log dollars by the middle of the last decade. And then it's decreased a little bit since then. For Hispanic workers, there's been a much higher level in all years, though a slightly more muted trend over time. Just a brief note about this decline at the end. I'm not going to focus on this too much, but I think it reflects a broader compression in the wage distribution, where in the last 8 or 10 years, kind of the 10th and 20th percentiles of the wage distribution have caught up a bit towards the middle. To get a sense of the magnitudes of these, so in 1998, this firm sorting term could explain about only 4% of the total Black-white earnings gap. Now it's up to about 15%. For the Hispanic-white earnings gap, it's been a stable 25%. So these are both pretty dramatic quantities, and it means firm segregation today causes about a 15%, or it increases the Black-white earnings gap by about 15%, and it increases the Hispanic-white earnings gap by a full quarter. Okay, so the last thing I said I would talk about is one explanation for this. So the idea here is that in the last 40 years, as a result of some of the transformations I discussed earlier, blue collar and service work has been increasingly shuttled off to low-paying establishments. So there's a pretty clear prediction here, which is if Black and Hispanic workers are already overrepresented in the ranks of blue collar and service occupations, this transformation will have further siloed them into low-paying workplaces. I'm going to measure this using a Kitagawa-Oaxaca blinder decomposition. If you're interested, I can show you the actual equations at the end, but I'll skip over it for now. To give you a sense of what I mean by this changing occupational sorting, we can look at the average firm pay associated with each of the 9 broad EEO occupations in 1978. These are relative to a reference group, which is office or clerical occupations. So already in 1978, service workers were concentrated in the lowest paying workplaces. But here's what it looks like in 2018. Service workers, sales workers, and laborers are really overconcentrated in the bottom of the firm distribution. Meanwhile, professionals have become increasingly dominant in the highest paying workplaces. So the question is, does this contribute to the rise of racial segregation by workplace that I've shown? So again, these are the figures I showed at the beginning, though now I'm zeroing them so they show you the change since 1978. So this is the total increase in the total between firm gap. Here's the amount that can be explained by the increased alignment of occupations and workplaces. So fixing occupational demographics at their 1978 levels, but allowing this transformation to take place. So what this shows is, with this really simple explanation of occupational alignment into low-paying workplaces, we can explain almost half of the growth in the black-white total between firm gap, and we can explain well over half of the growth in the Hispanic-white total between firm gap. So to clarify what this means, as blue-collar and service work has been siloed off into lower-paying workplaces, this has contributed massively to the relegation of Black and Hispanic workers in those same low-paying workplaces. Okay, so to summarize what I've covered, it was a series of 3 findings. So Black and Hispanic workers have long been overrepresented in low-paying firms, but this has become much more the case in recent years. Second, this has a large growing effect on racial pay inequality, increasing the black-white gap by about 15% and the Hispanic versus non-Hispanic white gap by a full quarter. And about half of this transformation can be explained by the relegation of blue-collar and service work to low-end firms. The main takeaway from this analysis is that we need to start thinking about racial pay inequality as a between-organization phenomenon. So what I mean by that is all the theories we're developing to talk about firms pulling apart as a result of fissuring or globalization, those theories have real implications for the structure of racial economic inequality in the US today. And there's also an important policy implication. So I would say one of the takeaways from this is we need to focus a little bit less maybe on inequality within workplaces and focus more of our attention on policies that apply beyond the borders of any given workplace. So policies that raise the floor for everyone, like minimum wage, paid family medical leave, that sort of thing. Lastly, I'll just note there's a couple next steps I'm working on. I'm going to add some richer information about these organizations. I'm going to extend this analysis back to the 60s, and I'm going to add some more person-level information like education. Thank you.